Welcome back this evening. It's time to slow down again, to let the noise of the day dissolve into something softer. Wherever you are, whatever you've carried through the hours, you can set it down now. There's nowhere to be, and nothing left that needs doing. Tonight's story is called The Harbor That Forgot the Morning. Let your thoughts drift, unbothered by direction or purpose. Let the sound of your breath take the place of time. The night will hold the rest. Close your eyes if you'd like, and follow me into this quiet space between sea and sky, where the fog lingers longer than it should, and the world waits patiently for the tide to remember what it came for. The harbor was still when I arrived, wrapped in a pale fog that seemed to have forgotten where it came from. The boats moved lazily, bumping against one another with soft thuds that echoed down the dock. Their ropes were heavy with moisture, creaking quietly as if whispering among themselves. The air was thick, not cold, not warm, just holding itself there, waiting for something unnamed. I walked along the wooden planks, my footsteps dull and softened by the mist. Somewhere nearby, I heard the faint metallic chime of a chain tapping against a mast. It repeated in slow rhythm, like a heartbeat, steady and unconcerned. The water beneath the docks shifted gently, turning the reflections of the lamps into long, trembling streaks of gold. I stopped at the edge of the pier and looked out across the water, though there wasn't much to see. The fog erased distance, making everything feel both close and unreachable. I liked that about fog, how it made the world seem smaller, almost kind. I can hear the occasional call of a gull, distant and directionless, as if it too had lost track of where the sky ended. A single fishing boat drifted near the edge of the moorings. Its name, half faded on the side, read Perseverance. The paint peeled at the corners, the letters worn thin by salt and years. I reached out to steady myself against a post, feeling the rough texture of old wood under my fingertips. The scent of seaweed, diesel, and something faintly metallic filled the air. The perfume of the harbor, unbothered by change. I continued on, passing a row of empty barrels and coiled nets. A lantern hung from a hook, still burning despite the lack of company. The flame flickered slightly, bending each time a breath of wind found its way through. It felt like the kind of light that might stay burning whether anyone needed it or not. I thought for a moment that I heard voices, low, conversational, friendly, coming from somewhere deeper in the fog. I paused, listening, but there was only the soft rhythm of water against wood. The sounds of the harbor have a way of pretending to be people when you're alone. I smiled to myself and kept walking. As I reached the far end of the dock, I noticed a small building with its door half open. The light spilling from inside was dim and yellow, cutting through the gray like a memory that refuses to fade. I stepped closer and peeked inside. The room was filled with benches, the air thick with the scent of coffee and salt. A kettle sat on a stove, quietly steaming. No one else was there. A map hung on the far wall, not of the harbor, but of the sea beyond it. The lines faint and hand-drawn. Small red pins marked spots along the edges, each one labeled with single words: drift, echo, wait. I sat at one of the benches for a few minutes, letting the warmth of the stove thaw the damp from my sleeves. The kettle rattled once, softly as if impatient. I poured myself a cup of water and watched the steam rise, curling like the fog outside. I thought maybe someone would appear, the owner, a fisherman, anyone, but no one did. Only the quiet stayed, patient as ever. Eventually, I stood and stepped back outside. The fog had thickened again, swallowing the outlines of the boats and the shore beyond. didn't feel oppressive, though. It was like the harbor wanted to keep me for a while longer, to show me something I hadn't yet learned to notice. I opened my eyes again and started walking toward the far end of the harbor, where the docks turned into stone and the water deepened into a darker shade. The fog thinned in places, forming soft gaps where I could see the surface of the sea more clearly. It looked thicker there, almost solid, as if you could walk out onto it if you promised not to look down. I passed a row of bollards, each one marked with a different number. Some were clear, some worn down to almost nothing. I trailed my fingers along them as I went, feeling the roughness under my skin. The numbers did not seem to follow any pattern. They rose, then fell, then skipped entire runs of digits, like the harbor had forgotten how to count in a straight line. Ahead, a small kiosk sat under a crooked awning. The shutters were halfway down, the glass fogged on the inside. A handwritten sign leaned against the window. I wiped away a bit of condensation with the back of my hand and squinted at the letters. They only said, "Back when the tide remembers." No time, no date, just that. I smiled at it, even though no one was there to see. It felt like a fair arrangement. The tide always remembers eventually. I continued along the stone walkway that followed the curve of the harbor wall. On one side, the water moved in slow folds. On the other, a row of buildings faced the sea, their windows catching what little light the fog allowed through. Some windows glowed softly from within. Others were dark and reflective, showing only blurred silhouettes of boat masts and lamps. There was a small bench tucked into a recess in the wall, half sheltered from the wind. I sat down and leaned back, letting the damp stone press against my shoulders. From there, I could hear the gentle slap of waves far below, hitting the same rocks again and again with endless patience. The sound was not loud, but it was persistent, like a thought that refuses to leave your mind until you finally agree to listen. I watched as a single gull glided into view, wings outstretched, riding the air just above the water. It made a slow circle and disappeared into the fog again. For a moment, I wondered if it ever landed, or if it simply existed in that loop, always turning, always vanishing. After a while, I stood and followed a set of narrow steps that led down closer to the water. The stones here were darker, slick with moisture. I placed each foot carefully, feeling the chill rise from below. At the bottom of the steps, a small platform jutted out over the water. A metal ladder descended beyond it, disappearing into the sea. I looked down at it, at the rungs coated with years of salt and time, and thought about climbing down, just to see how the world looked from that lower angle. I did not climb, though. I stayed where I was and watched the surface. The sea moved slowly, but with purpose. A small piece of driftwood floated past, turning lazily, as if it had nowhere urgent to be. I followed it with my eyes until it blended into the darker water and was gone. The bell out beyond the harbor sounded again, a single low note this time, like a yawn. The sound rolled through the fog and across the water, bounced off the stone, and reached me a moment later, softer but still full. I let it wash through me and then fade. Eventually, I turned back to the stairs and climbed up, my hand resting lightly on the railing. The harbor above waited, unchanged and unhurried. Somewhere in that stillness, I thought I heard wings, but when I looked up, there was only fog. Back on the main walkway, I drifted away from the water for a bit and toward the cluster of buildings that huddled near the docks. Their facades were a mixture of peeling paint and old stone, patched and repainted over the years. Signs hung over a few doors, swaying gently in the damp air. Some were still legible: Harbor Cafe, Tackle and Line, Rooms to Let. Others were so worn they were little more than ghosts of letters. I passed a cafe with small round tables outside, chairs tucked in neatly. Each tabletop had a thin film of water beating on its surface, reflecting the glow of the lamps above in trembling patterns. Through the window, I could see shelves of cups and a counter with a metal coffee machine sitting still and silent, waiting for a morning that hadn't arrived yet. A chalkboard by the door listed a menu, but the words had blurred, the chalk lines running together into soft white streaks. I thought about going inside, but I knew there would be no one there. This felt like a night made for wandering rather than sitting, so I walked on. Farther down, I came upon a narrow doorway with a lantern burning above it. The glass of the lantern was cracked, splitting the light into delicate fractures that spilled across the stone like spiderwebs. A small brass plaque beside the door read, "Harbor Office." I paused, listening for any sound from within. Nothing. Just the muffled drum of water somewhere beyond the wall and the quiet hiss of the lantern flame. I stepped away and followed a side street that led away from the harbor for a short distance. The fog clung to the cobblestones, pooling around my ankles as I walked. On one side, a line of low houses stood shoulder to shoulder, their windows covered in lace curtains. On the other, a long brick wall stretched into shadow, ivy crawling across it in thin strands that looked almost like handwriting. I now found myself stopping at a gate set into that wall. It was made of iron, painted once, now worn down to a soft dullness. Through the bars, I could see a small courtyard with a lone tree planted in the center. The tree's branches were bare but not dead. They reached up into the fog like someone lifting their arms in a slow stretch. A single lantern sat at the base of the trunk, unlit. I could not tell if the courtyard belonged to anyone. It had the look of a place that had been claimed by time, rather than a person. I watched it for a long breath, then continued on, letting the gate close itself behind me. The street curved back toward the harbor eventually, as if gently admitting that it could only wander so far before returning. I followed it until the sound of the water grew louder again. The smell of salt crept back into the air, bringing with it the faint scent of fish and rope and weather. Soon I was back where the wooden docks began, boards laid out like an invitation. The fog had shifted slightly, pulling back from the shore and gathering more thickly over the open water. The boats were clearer now. I could see their names, their chipped paint, the lines of their hulls. Each one seemed to be holding a story under its deck, a story written in rust and tide marks and small repairs. I stepped onto one dock and felt it give a little under my weight, then steady. The water moved beneath it, a slow and calming rise and fall. I walked toward the end, where the harbor opened out into the wider sea, and let the sound of the waves and the creak of the ropes fill the spaces in my mind that usually held worry. Here, in this in-between place of fog and water and worn wood, the hours had no edges. Only the slow rhythm of the tide and the feeling that the night could last forever. As I stood there at the end of the dock, the fog parted just enough to show me a faint outline of something farther out. It was not another boat, it was a structure, low and dark, sitting on the water like a forgotten thought, a floating platform maybe, or an old barge left anchored and abandoned. Lights glowed along its sides, soft and muted, as if wrapped in cloth. I squinted, but the details refused to come into focus. It stayed more idea than object, hovering at the edge of recognition. I watched it for a while, feeling the dock sway, feeling the water breathe. Then another puff of fog slid in front of it, and it was gone again, as if the harbor had decided I'd seen enough. I continued along the dock until I reached a small shack near its middle. The door was ajar, and a thin stripe of orange light cut across the boards. I tapped gently on the frame and pushed it open a little farther. Inside, the room was lined with shelves holding jars, coils of rope, spare metal hooks, and boxes marked with hand-scrawled words. A small heater in the corner glowed dull red. Above it hung a coat that looked heavy enough to stand on its own. On the table in the center sat a ledger, open to a page filled with neat columns of writing, names, dates, and something else in the rightmost column. Small notes like returned, delayed, still out. One entry simply read, "Lost in fog. Will be back when fog remembers." There was no name beside it, no date. I let my fingers rest lightly on the edge of the table. The paper had that soft, worn quality that only comes from being handled often. I did not read anymore. Some records are not for strangers. I stepped back outside and gently pulled the door until it rested the way I had found it, just barely open. The fog pressed close again, folding around the shack, the dock, and me. I walked back toward the harbor wall, taking my time, matching my pace to the roll of the water. When I reached the stone walkway again, a light drizzle had begun to fall. The drops were small and quiet, barely making a sound as they landed on the water. They created tiny circles that grew and overlapped until the entire surface shimmered with soft movement. Under the street lamps, they looked like a million little thoughts appearing and disappearing before anyone could catch them. I tilted my head back and let a few drops land on my face. They were cool and clean, smelling faintly of salt, but mostly of nothing at all. The fog around me glowed faintly where the lamps shone through it, turning the air into something almost solid. I continued along the seawall, passing the same benches as before, though now they looked different in the wet light. The wood glistened, and small beads of water collected along the edges, hanging there for a moment before falling in slow, reluctant drops. One bench near the end of the row had a small object resting on it. I stepped closer and saw that it was a glove, dark and worn, fingers curled in on themselves. Only one. The other was nowhere in sight. I picked it up and turned it over once or twice. It had the shape of a hand that had been busy once, tying ropes, pulling lines, steadying itself against rough weather. I placed the glove back exactly where I had found it. Some things are better left waiting for whoever might return. By now, the drizzle had softened to a fine mist again, more felt than seen. The harbor seemed quieter than before, as if even the boats had grown drowsy. I could no longer hear any engines, no metal clanging, no hurried voices. Only the steady, gentle sounds remained, water touching stone, rope shifting, the occasional wing beat of a passing bird somewhere in the dark. I made my way back toward the lighthouse, drawn to it without entirely deciding to go there. Its shape rose out of the fog like a patient memory. The narrow path leading up to it was slick with moisture, small stones embedded in the earth, glinting faintly with each step I took. At the base of the lighthouse, I paused and looked up. The lantern at the top still burned, steady and slow. It did not sweep across the sea the way some lights do. It just glowed, marking its place, saying, "Here," in a way that did not require movement. The door was still slightly open, as if the building expected me. I slipped inside once more, feeling the air change, the warmth close around me. The spiral staircase waited, and I climbed it again, each step familiar now. The stone walls curled around me in a soft curve, and the sound of my footsteps blended with the distant pulse of the sea. At the top, the lantern room greeted me with its quiet glow. I walked to the window and rested my hands on the metal frame. The glass was cool under my palms. Outside, the fog pressed itself against the panes, but I could see beyond it in patches, small sections of water and sky where the gray had thinned. The harbor looked softer from up here. The boats were just small shapes, the dock's lines drawn in pale strokes. The town behind them was a faint suggestion of roofs and windows. Everything felt reduced to essentials: water, light, air, and space. I stood there for a long moment, breathing in time with the faint sway of the lighthouse. The building seemed to move with the wind, not in a way that could be seen, but in a way that could be felt, like a slow, careful nod. I thought of all the mornings this harbor must have seen, the ones where the fog cleared quickly, revealing a bright, sharp sky, the ones where it refused to leave until the day was nearly over, the stormy mornings, the still ones, the mornings that fell on days no one remembered later. Tonight, it seemed, the harbor had simply decided to forget the morning altogether. The world was content to linger in this soft, uncertain hour where nothing needed to begin and nothing had to end. I let that thought settle, then turned away from the window. The light behind me continued its quiet work. I descended the stairs one more time, listening to the sounds of the harbor grow louder again with each step I took downward. Outside, the air felt heavier, but gentler too. I walked back along the path and down toward the water, then finally toward the edge of town, where the cobblestones gave way to ordinary pavement. The fog thinned as I went, but never completely left. It stayed around the edges, as if reluctant to let the night go. I did not look back at the harbor once I reached the first row of houses. I did not need to. I knew it would remain there, perfectly itself, holding its quiet place where sea and land meet and time forgets what it was supposed to be doing. And somewhere out there, an owl called once through the fog, and then the harbor was silent again. So here's where the story ends. As you lie asleep, whisked away by thoughts and dreams that no longer need words, the night has taken what it needs. The gentle weight of your tired mind, the soft trail of images that came and went without asking for attention. If you're still awake, that's all right. Sleep never needs to be forced. It arrives in its own time, like the tide returning to shore. All you have to do is stay where you are, safe, calm, and heavy with rest. The world will keep spinning quietly. The air will stay soft around you. And this moment, this small space between night and morning, will hold you as long as you need. Drift a little deeper now. The story is over, but the dream goes on.